Started. Um, Welcome everybody tonight. My name is Mandy Askins. I'm the Assistant Collections Manager for the Cincinnati Observatory. And this is our very first virtual presentation for a new series we're going to call History at Home. So this year we're really excited to kind of showcase more of the historical aspect of the Cincinnati Observatory. You know, we are the birthplace of American astronomy. And we're also a National Historic Landmark. And education and obviously preservation are kind of a key to our overall mission. So, showcasing these historical stories at the observatory, about 180 years of history, but also there's going to be science in there because that's also a really big part of what we do. This presentation here kind of piggybacks on our current exhibit, which is up, and it will be up through the end of May, and it's called Eclipses, Past, Present, and Future, where we showcase various efforts of directors and staff members at the observatory chasing eclipses, where they would actually leave on expeditions across the country to document total solar eclipses. So, when we think about a total solar eclipse, most of us, if we never left the place that we're currently at, we would be very unlikely to see it in our lifetime. So they're really significant events. And obviously the observatory being, the first public observatory in the United States, it was also a pretty significant research institution up until around 1978. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, and we'll go to the next one here. Oh, if I can get, actually, I can't get my slide to, oh, there we go. We're going to talk a little bit about what eclipses are. And a lot of this is based on photography. We have around 1,500 lantern slides, glass plate negatives in our collection, which we're about halfway through digitizing. So, my day-to-day job is managing the observatory's collections and archives, which also includes digitizing these images and putting on exhibits. So we're going to talk about some of the early photographic methods that were used to just in general photography, but also obviously to take pictures of a solar eclipse, and what astrophotography was like in the late 19th century. It was pretty new then, as well as photography in general, and really Cincinnati's significance in early astrophotography. We'll also talk about the 1869 eclipse that was led by director Cleveland Abbey to the Dakota Territory in that expedition, as well as another one in 1932 led by Dr. Everett Yao in New Hampshire. And then we'll talk about the upcoming Great American Eclipse in April, and then some other ways that you can kind of learn about eclipses and history and obviously science here at the Cincinnati Observatory. So we'll kind of get started. And it's important to obviously know what an eclipse is. So we're looking at this presentation as a way of saying, many of you probably know what this is, but maybe not all of you. So we're going to kind of review that. So there's two types of eclipses. We have lunar and solar. The position of the Earth, the sun, and the moon determine the type of eclipse. And during a solar eclipse, the moon is between the Earth and the sun, which causes the moon to block the sun. And solar eclipses only occur when the moon is new. And a lunar eclipse happens when the moon passes through Earth's shadow and only occurs during a full moon. So you can kind of see the diagram there. And we recently had an annular eclipse or a partial eclipse. So we were not in that path of totality. So we only got to see partial, actually it was pretty cloudy that day, so we didn't get to see quite a lot. But we only really got to see a partial eclipse at that point. But in April, we'll get to see a total eclipse, which is really significant. And we're very excited about that. So the last total solar eclipse, if I can get my screen to move. Oops, sorry about that. You can see here the last total solar eclipse. I actually can't even see my screen, Nicole. I'm sorry about that.
I can see it.
Yeah, it went away. There we go. In October, we had an annular eclipse. And then you can see that total solar eclipses are really pretty rare. And then we won't have another one until the year 3000 here in the area of Cincinnati. And obviously the moon likes to photobomb the sun when that comes on. So we'll talk a little bit about early photographic methods. So this is significant because we'll talk more about different types of photographic methods. So kind of understanding what these mean when I'm talking about them. So we have the camera obscura, which is when you think of a pinhole camera, it's not really a camera. It's not taking a photograph, but it will project an image, which often allowed artists to draw images of something that they would see. And then the 1830s, we had what was called photogenic drawings. And then 1839 is really when photography as we know it existed, which was daguerreotypes with Louis Daguerre. And then 1841, we had calotypes or salted paper prints. 1850s, the wet plate collodion process, which will come kind of more into our presentation later. And then 1871, the dry plate process, which really kind of allowed photography to really take off because it was a lot easier, a lot less chemicals, and a lot less exposure times. So many of you, if you're from Cincinnati, you've probably seen this panorama. It's the Cincinnati panorama of 1848 with Fontaine and Porter. And you can see the observatory kind of right almost smack in the middle at the very top, where our original location was in Mount Adams. And obviously this panorama spans kind of the whole riverfront of Cincinnati. But this was one of the earlier daguerreotypes, at least. This was probably likely one of the first panoramas ever taken, but also one of the earlier daguerreotypes taken in Cincinnati. We actually believe that the very first scholar, the first person to experiment with photography in the greater Cincinnati area was John Locke. And it's not the John Locke that we know when it comes to political science. He just happened to have the same name. He was a professor of chemistry at the Medical College of Ohio. It was located in Cincinnati. Later on, that became part of what we now know as the University of Cincinnati. And he experimented with, he called them the photogenic process, but they were daguerreotypes. And this was in 1839, the same year that Louis Daguerre in France invented the daguerreotype and kind of showcased that to the world. We do know that Locke was likely in France around the same time and probably a contemporary of Daguerre. So it's not 100% for sure, but we are pretty sure that Locke was likely the first person to produce a daguerreotype or a modern photography print here in the United States, and this was in Cincinnati. And it was displayed actually at Alexander Flash's bookstore on 3rd Street in Cincinnati. He took a bunch of prints, and he thought that these would be really useful, especially in teaching at the medical college. Showing these pictures of what a liver might look like and other things like that. These would be really great visual aids. And then we have Ezekiel Hawkins actually established the very first Daguerrean studio in Cincinnati in 1840. So within 1 year, we have another studio in Cincinnati producing daguerreotype photographs. And then by 1850, Cincinnati had 6 studios. And then by 1851, Cincinnati had 32 daguerreotype studios, which took portraits of around 16,000 people. So we're looking at about a decade. Within a decade, photography really blew up in Cincinnati. Obviously, at that point, we were around the 6th largest city in the United States. So when it comes to that kind of larger city that's really producing a lot of art and innovations, Cincinnati was kind of on the forefront of photography in general at that point. We also have a famous photographer named Charles Waldeck, who took another panorama of Cincinnati in 1860. And this was done and printed through the calotype salted paper print process. And then we have John Wildman Winder. And I always like to tease that if I had to choose a middle name, I would choose Wildman or maybe Wild Woman. But in 1866, he produced another panorama of Cincinnati using an album and print from the wet plate negative. So a wet plate process is not a daguerreotype. These are not daguerreotypes, but it does allow for quite a clear image. And he actually took these portraits on the top of what's now, what at the time was known as Mozart Hall, or on the top floor of the Catholic Institute which was later remodeled as the Grand Opera House. And there's a huge, big panorama there. And the album in print is a way to produce images on paper, actually using what we think of like as an egg yolk, the albumin as well. So 18 years later, he produces this daguerreotype, and Winder will come in play a little bit later when we talk about astrophotography at the observatory. So 18 years since Fontaine and Porter did the Cincinnati panorama, Winder produced these images. And you can actually see it's kind of hard at the very top of the hill there. It's covered by trees, so it must have been summer at the time, but the original Mount Adams Observatory is on the top of that hill. And if you look towards the right, you can see the Church of the Immaculata, which we still have up on Mount Adams today. He had many studios in numerous locations in Cincinnati, Winder & Co. on 5th and 4th Street. In 1857, his studio was advertised as Winder's Great Western Ambrotype and Melanotype Gallery. And at this time, Cincinnati was the 8th largest city in the world, or in the country. And its population had nearly doubled in that 18 years since Fontaine and Porter took the famous panorama. So quite a lot more. We could see the development of Cincinnati in these pictures. But Winder was pretty known he had numerous studios producing hundreds and hundreds of portraits a day. And at this point, daguerreotypes had really kind of phased out. They only really had a short period of time. The largest collection of daguerreotypes in the area are actually at the Cincinnati Museum Center. In their archives, they have which is only a couple hundred daguerreotypes, but it's one of the larger collections from at least in this area. So here you can see what was the Grand Opera House later on. But so on the top of this building is where he took those portraits. So when we think about astrophotography in the late 19th century, it was pretty new. We think about Daguerre inventing the daguerreotype along with his co-inventor in France in 1839. He was also really interested in astronomy. He was interested in photographing not just people on Earth, but obviously also space. So we actually have here the earliest surviving daguerreotype of the moon. So 1 year later, John William Draper took this photograph. You can see it's pretty what in the collections field we call it degraded. It's really difficult to see it, but it is still surviving. Then we have another one in here taken at the Royal Observatory in Prussia. So this is probably one of the earlier, clearer ones that we've ever seen. So if we're thinking about 1839, and then we get to 1869, 30 years of photography, 30 years that modern photography has been around. And we have Dr. Cleveland Abbey, who was the second director for the Cincinnati Observatory. And he decided that he wanted to lead an expedition for the 1869 eclipse. There we go, Cleveland Abbey. He was also known as America's first weather forecaster, helped to found the U.S. National Weather Service. At the time, it was the National Weather Bureau, proponent of National Standard Time, and did quite a lot. But as our second director, he was really a big proponent of getting the observatory moved to a more suitable location. At that time, the observatory, after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, financially it wasn't doing very well. The building was in quite disrepair, and the finances of the board and of the Cincinnati Astronomical Society at the time were pretty minimal. So when he announces that he would really like to take an expedition to the Dakota Territory, which was at that time thought to be probably the furthest west expedition. We actually find out later that there was one in Alaska, but at least in the continental United States, it was the furthest west. We had quite a few expedition parties in Iowa and kind of all along that path of totality. But really the eclipse of 1869 was this really rare opportunity of discovery and redemption for astronomers and scientists, as the eclipse of 1860 was really clouded out across North America. And the decades prior really saw a lot of significant advancement in technology and mathematics to provide astronomers the tools to predict, prepare, and set up for eclipses. Throughout the mid-19th century, such eclipse expeditions enabled astronomers to kind of refine their theories on solar and lunar motion to generate tables that would improve navigational accuracy. They also raised new questions about undiscovered celestial bodies and the nature of the solar corona and the precision of observational techniques. So when we think about the 1869 expedition, a lot of astronomers were really excited about this, because not only do we have the tools to predict, not only do we have the tools to document the science of these eclipses, we also now have more significant advances in photography. During this time, we would have had what's called the wet plate process. So these are not daguerreotypes, but it's still pretty cumbersome, but it's a lot easier than other photographic methods prior to this. So on July 28th, 1869, Abby left Cincinnati with an expedition party to Sioux Falls, Dakota Territory, to document the eclipse. With really limited resources, he kind of gathered all that he could. He borrowed equipment from colleagues. He got railroad companies to give them reduced fares because of what they were doing was really significant. And he was able to even get a group of men to pay their own way this whole time, including W.C. Taylor, which was a photographer out of Philadelphia. So we'll talk a little bit about him in a bit. And a lot of it was also just the generosity of local individuals staying in colleagues' homes, a friend of a friend of a friend, to make it all the way to Fort Dakota. So here you can see historical photo of Fort Dakota. And actually, they set up camp not far from where that flagpole is in this image. So it really kind of shows the tenacity and that push for scientific endeavor at that time. And on the day of the eclipse, clouds really threatened to obscure and kind of ruin this monumental event. Thankfully, they parted, and the skies cleared almost immediately before the eclipse began. And then Abby even noted that he saw a few clouds pass in front of the sun through his telescope that day. Totality lasts around 3.5 minutes, with the entirety of the eclipse being around 2 hours and 4 minutes, which is about what we're going to expect depending on where you're at on April 8th. We're looking at between 3 and 4 minutes of totality, depending on where you are at in that path. But what's interesting about Abby is, as someone who researches and learns a lot about the various directors in our history here at the observatory, he was absolutely meticulous in all of his records. The University of Cincinnati archives house quite a lot of some of our observatory records. And in those records, I came across this envelope along with this little card, and also a series of over 20 images that were taken that day in 1869, as well as a whole box of journals. So each man on this expedition took meticulous, they each had a job to do. One might be meteorology, one might be observing, one might be other measurements, but each one took very meticulous journals and notes of this expedition. Abby also happened to have very beautiful handwriting and very easy to read as a historian. So here I found this envelope. It was shoved in a box with all these other journals and kind of slid behind the journals. And when I open it, I discover all of these images, which was very exciting for us, especially as we are developing this exhibit. And you can see here that the printer of the images that I'm about to show you was John Wildman Winder in Cincinnati. So at that time, he was pretty famous, obviously not just for his studios, but also for printing. Taylor, once he got back So by August 1869, Abby has these prints in his hand from the 1869 eclipse. They are about 1 inch square, and they're printed on almost like a vellum-like paper. And we can actually see kind of the progression of that eclipse. But what's significant about these, we know that other images were taken during that eclipse, especially a lot in Iowa, and many of those made local newspapers and other things like that. But what's significant about these is that, one, they made it all the way to the Dakota Territory. At one point, they had to take an 82-mile wagon train, two-team wagon team to actually get to Fort Dakota. But they also set up a makeshift dark room out of the tent of one of the wagons, and Taylor was in this makeshift dark room the entire time taking pictures of this eclipse. And I see I have I don't have a question. So, when we think about the significance of photography at the time, we did not have a lot of images of solar eclipses prior to 1869, especially not clear ones such as these. And unfortunately, Cleveland Abbey, if I can get down here, Cleveland Abbey left the observatory in 1870. So, when we think about why were these images not published anywhere, we have record that he wrote reports to the board. He did articles for various Cincinnati newspapers documenting and talking about the expedition. And then it just kind of goes away, because we know that the 1869 eclipse was really a national phenomenon. Harper's Magazine published photos of the eclipse, which was likely one of the first mass publications in the United States to ever do so. And then there were even, right here, we can see musical scores, which you can find at the Library of Congress. So if you would ever like to play the 1869 eclipse polka, you can download the sheet music and play it to your heart's content. But the observatory's photos never were publicly published. The only place currently that they are, I guess, accessible to the public would be if you wanted to make an appointment with UC Archives and see them for yourself, our current exhibit, and then one dissertation many years ago by someone that was also interested in early astrophotography. Those are the only places, at least, that I have found where they've been published. So we believe that Abby, just him leaving in 1870, kind of just, those photographs just were never published, but they are probably, at least from my historical record and the things that I've seen, some of the most significant and clearest photographs of the eclipse of 1869. Here's some of his notes, also from UC Archives, including equipment lists and finances spent and all of that. So do I have any questions at this moment? I don't believe I do. So we'll move on to the 1932 expedition. So at this point, Dr. Everett Yao was our director. The observatory was doing quite well. We had already moved to our current location on Mount Lookout, and we had both buildings at that time, and quite a big staff. We had an assistant director as well as another newer assistant astronomer. So this was in North Stratford, New Hampshire. So here on this photograph, you can see on your right is Dr. Yao, and then on the other side is Dr. Elliott Smith. So he came to the observatory in 1907, initially to work on our meridian circle instrument. But at that time, he was assistant director. And in February 1932, Yao gained permission from the University of Cincinnati Board of Directors, because at this point we were owned by University of Cincinnati. It was part of an extension of their campus. And all directors at that time were also professors of astronomy in various classes at UC. So they led an expedition party to view this total solar eclipse. And their goal, they had a scientific goal for this, was to determine the exact position of the moon with reference to the sun by observing the time of contact and also by photographing the partial eclipse at intervals, and for the corona to be photographed by selective light. Yao led the expedition party from Cincinnati to North Stratford, New Hampshire, and that August, early August. They were there actually a total of almost a month. And part of this party was Dr. Yao and his wife, Elizabeth Carrington Yao, who also at one point was what we call a computer at the observatory. So she did mathematical calculations. And you can see her. She is actually the one sitting at the bottom there, center. And then we also had Dr. Elliott Smith and Mrs. Louise Stroutman Smith, who was also a computer. We like to tease that there's a lot of love at the observatory. And as our Valentine's Day events come on, you also get to learn a little bit more about it. But, when you're observing and you are at, the telescope late at night, I guess that's just how love blossoms. But you can see Elliott Smith there, center and sitting. And then Louise is actually on the far left corner. For some reason, she looks very grumpy. And a lot of these photos, maybe she didn't like the long trip. I'm not sure. And then next to her, center in the back is Paul Herget. At that time, he had not received his doctorate. So he was the observatory's last director and retired in 1978. But at that time, he was fairly new. And he was actually dating Dr. Smith's daughter, which is down there at the very bottom left. So she's kind of like tilting her head this way, Harriet Smith. And later on, they married. They actually met in high school at Withrow High School. And then on the far right, we have the owner of the land that they set up this expedition party, Mr. Farnsworth. And so he was a colleague of directors and assistants there. They were also joined by Professor Anderson from Miami University. All the equipment and instruments were packed and shipped by a freight car rail to New Hampshire, where the party from Cincinnati initially met them at the Farnsworth family farm on August 5th. They set up camp on their farm, including the 10-inch Cook camera, which we currently have on display with our exhibit. The Cook camera has taken quite a lot of photographs, even at the observatory over many years. Quite a lot of our lantern slides are part of our images that were taken with the Cook camera of space. And then also a 4-inch Alvin Clark & Sons refractor, transit instruments, tripod, as well as obviously a lot of film holders, and just quite a lot of other extensive equipment. In the weeks leading up to the eclipse, they set up camp. We have a much bigger operation than we did in 1869, but we also have a lot more instrumentation that will aid in really scientifically documenting the eclipse. So the weeks leading up to it, they camped out. The directors gave lectures all across town. They had observing parties on the farm, and really kind of just, when we think about the observatory today and how significant outreach is, they were doing outreach at this point and spent almost an entire month in New Hampshire setting up and gearing up for this eclipse, keeping track of weather and all of those things. Then on August 30th, another large group from Cincinnati arrived, and then a second group in the morning of the 31st. So it's estimated that at least 40 or 50 people were there at that time to just observe. So many of them from Cincinnati, but also a lot of them from the town. So most of these photographs that you're viewing, there's Dr. Yao right there in the center, looking very relaxed, that his equipment is all set up, the Cook camera right above him inside that box that you see. Most of these photographs were actually taken by Harriet Smith. So when we think about, this is a scientific endeavor, but it's also really a story of family and people that worked very closely with each other. There was at one point a house on the grounds of the observatory, which housed the director and his family. And then obviously we have that love and that marriage and all of that. So Harriet, here took took a lot of these photos. We have, I can't bring up my chat right here. It's not allowing me to do it.
It was just me saying, I hope I'm that relaxed on April 8th.
Oh, okay. For some my cursor, so I can't pull up my chat very well, which will work these kinks out next time. But yeah, so Harriet had produced a scrapbook, which we have on display with our current exhibit, which actually really allowed us to figure out who everybody was in the images. It's really cute because a lot of them you can see later on after the expedition, her and Paul go off on like a little side trip and they're taking photos of each other in a photo, like a waterfall and things like that. But Dr. Smith's daughter at this time, Harriet, is the one that took the majority of the images that you will see here. Which it just gives us kind of personal insight into the relationships of people at the observatory. There's even images of like picnics and children in the neighborhood. I do not have them all up here. There's probably 40 or 50 of them that we've digitized. So here you can see them setting it up. And we do like to remind, which I think, this is kind of a newer research endeavor for the observatory, that it wasn't just the directors that worked here. There were assistants, there were computers, there were a lot of other people, and quite a lot of women worked here at the observatory as well. When we think of Mrs. Yowell and Mrs. Smith, they were very well educated in their own right, and assisted with the setup of a lot of this equipment, as well as a lot of the mathematical calculations. So we do plan to open up an exhibit later this summer about women that worked at the observatory. So you'll learn a little bit more about them then. So here's a little bit more. You can see Paul Herget there sitting down, and then Dr. Smith adjusting something. So in the days leading up to, here's a picture of our Cook camera. This was actually when it was at Indiana University. We lent it to them for quite a many years. And then also did co-research with them so that they could photograph the images that we were especially with the Minor Planet Center, the images, the items that we were tracking in the night sky. And recently we've done quite a lot of conservation work on the Cook camera. So you can see here how one section looks quite and shiny and brass-like. That is hours of scrubbing. So it takes quite a lot of time to get all of those many, many years of tarnish off. And that's going to be a consistent kind of constant research or conservation effort that we'll be doing. We've also recently done quite a lot of conservation work on the Mitchell telescope. So if you do come by soon, you can look and see, and it's quite shiny, but it's also protected. We use an archival wax around these objects to protect it from any further degradation and tarnish. So really the days leading up to August 31st of the eclipse, people were really excited about it. And as the time neared, though, the weather didn't look good, which I think is something that all of us that really are excited about the April eclipse, we're hoping that it's not clouded out like the annular one was in October. And we're hoping that we get that full experience. Unfortunately for the 1932 expedition party, it was pretty much entirely clouded out. There's a couple of images that were taken, and you can't even tell that that's really an eclipse. You can kind of see some clouds, sort of an image of something, but really not much was taken. So unfortunately, it didn't work out for them. But Dr. Yowell describes in his report to the board that although it was clouded out, during totality, the chickens went to roost. Animals behaved as though it were night. A pronounced chill in the temperature occurred. Darkness and a peculiar atmospheric colors were evident, and phases occurred as predicted. So really, it wasn't quite the experience that they were hoping for. But with these images, I think it really kind of shows that we have at the observatory, being the first is significant, but we also have this really rich history of really intricate relationships and all these people working together, much like I feel like we still do today, going out and teaching people astronomy and doing that outreach, much like a family, I think. So here you can see some of the party here. So actually in this one, Harriet's in the photograph. So we know Paul is taking it because he's not in there. Harriet is front and center between the two young girls. And then you can see Mr. Farnsworth on the far left. Again, grumpy Louise Stratman Smith next to her. I'm not sure what, I'm always curious to what's going on in someone's mind in these photographs, because we have plenty of other photographs of her being quite happy and cheerful. And then on the right side, you can see Dr. Smith again and Dr. Yao, and then also Mrs. Yao in the middle. This photograph was taken after the eclipse as they're heading back, and, kind of perusing the area. We actually have a brochure of a place that they stayed there in New Hampshire at a lodge. And much like today, eclipse glasses were pretty significant. So I think we're selling them in our gift shop now. Obviously, if you are a member, you also would get, and renewing your membership, you would get your own eclipse glasses for April. But in 1932, they were also mass produced, which they didn't have the little, sides to them, but you would just hold them up. I had a question at my last presentation, what would they have done in 1860s or 1869? There were quite a few other filters, but you could have really used a smoked glass, or what we now call a welder's glass, to be able to safely view the sun, because we all know that we do not want to look directly at the sun at any time, except that very small moment of pure totality. Here, again, from the archives at University of Cincinnati, expenses. Things were a lot cheaper in 1932 than they are today. So a total of $306 for the 3 staff members at the observatory to do this eclipse. So quite a lot cheaper. I don't even think you could pay for gas to get to New Hampshire and back for $300 now. So we are really excited about the 2024 eclipse. We're going to be including more programming, such as history programming and science programming, through the end of May, I believe. At least I know I will be with when it comes to history. But here you can see the path of totality for the one on the 2024 eclipse is on your right-hand side. And really, at the observatory, we are not in that path of totality. So we will not be there. We will be north. I will be in Dayton, Ohio, and other staff members will be in a lot of other places. Again, doing that outreach and chasing eclipses, much like our predecessors have, and explaining why these things are just so spectacular to see and view, and that it's a once in a lifetime chance for most people. In a lot of ways, it's a once in a generational chance for anyone to view a total solar eclipse. So we really do recommend that you go to, eventually here soon, we're going to have very soon a whole page on our website about information about the eclipse. You can also go to NASA's website. They have an interactive map. There's also a website through the state of Ohio that will show you the best places in Ohio to visit. And then, as always, practice safe solar viewing. This is one of my favorite memes because, we all love Chuck Norris. And I can't see your faces, so I don't know my generational. Okay, people are laughing. Some people are laughing. But I'm pretty sure a solar eclipse would go blind if it stared at Chuck Norris. So, okay, we have to make this. Originally, I did this talk for a history happy hour. So when you're giving this talk to people that are imbibing, they laugh at a little bit more things. So. We will have a lot more of these presentations, and they're all going to be announced probably in the first week of February. The next presentation I'll be giving are on female pioneers in eclipse science, so women who chase the sun. There'll be another one on the mythology of eclipses, so related to history, science, and fiction. I'm a very big science fiction fan, so we'll talk a little bit about Isaac Asimov and science, science fiction and mythology. And a lot more other programming related to the eclipse, as well as future ones. Later on in the fall, I'll be giving a presentation on the early explorations of space and how Ohio was significant in that. So I really do hope that you enjoyed tonight. I also hope that you will, continue to come to some of these presentations. Our History Bites program is a lunchtime lecture on a Friday. So you bring a bagged lunch, and then we can discuss. So I love virtual programs. I think that they're a fantastic way to provide access to people, but also those in-person ones are just really valuable. So if you're ever able to make it personally to the observatory, we would also really love that. And then we have our History Bites at night, which I guess depending on the time of the year, it's going to start at 5:30. So we are going to do that the same kind of, all programs will be cycled through about 3 times. So a lunchtime, an evening, and a virtual one. So please check our website and check out, Steve, what more things we have to offer this year. So I don't know if I have any other questions. I will go ahead and stop screen sharing, and then I can bring it up and see if there's chats.
You guys are welcome to, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand or on your video indicate that you want to be unmuted, and we can always unmute you as well if you have any additional questions, and would prefer to vocalize those.
Any questions? I figured Eric here is in our is in here now, and he is one of our, he's a fabulous astrophotographer, and we're really happy to have him on the team. Obviously astrophotography has come quite a long way since 1869, but we do continue the same kind of work that our directors did many years ago. So I'm open for any questions if you have any. It can be about what I talked about, or even these items that are in our collections. 1869. So did they use, Eric is asking, regarding the 1869 eclipse, you said those photos were taken on lantern slides, right? Did they use a telescope to take that photo, or was it with a dedicated camera? So it was actually it was through a telescope, obviously with a filter, and the telescope itself with the filter was actually popping out of the makeshift tent, makeshift dark room, and then they were able to, through the lens, actually produce those prints. So from what I understand, W.C. Taylor, who took the photographs, at least documented in his journals, he was actually the one processing them, because you have to do the wet plate process, and these are longer exposure times than we're used to now. And then his assistant, which was actually his brother-in-law, was actually at the telescope and putting in that film to expose the film, so then that Taylor could process it. So it's not quite the way that we think of cameras today, but it was, so it's pretty significant when you think about, you're under a tent in Dakota Territory in the middle of nowhere, and you're producing images like these that are just pretty profound. So when we think about photography in Cincinnati, and especially astrophotography, it's significant. We will also be featured in a documentary, hopefully, that will showcase this fall, and it's going to be part of the Photo Focus Biennial, and it's a National Endowment for the Humanities funded documentary on the photographic history of Cincinnati. So we're going to be, I think, in 1 or 2 episodes, myself and then Craig Mimi, who is our facility and collections manager, talking about astrophotography and the significance of the Cincinnati Observatory in that capacity. So look forward to more. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate you joining tonight, and we really hope that you come back soon. And if you're not already members, please join. We actually have quite a few other extra virtual classes this year that will only be part of, that will only be accessible to members. So we're really excited to do that this year. Thank you.